First, I want to go back to a time when governments actually lived within their means. They focused on paying off our national debt rather than further entrenching spending we can't afford, not to mention playing a whole lot of accounting tricks with $80 billion in spending being so-called off budget. It was the fiscal rules, such as keeping tax under a certain percentage of GDP, capping spending and insisting that new spending is offset by savings, that helped Peter Costello and John Howard deliver 10 straight budget surpluses. And even Labor treasurers of old, like Paul Keating, well, he well understood these rules. Joining me now is someone who served with Peter Costello and John Howard in Cabinet during this time of economic maturity. Long lost, I'm afraid, former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson. John, we'll get to a lot of contemporary issues in a moment, but you were there when we took that historic decision to pay back $96 billion of debt. I make the point our debt's now going to hit over $1 trillion. It took a decade to get $100 billion paid off. A trillion's 1,000 billion. That's a long, long effort required. But do we have the ticket to do it anymore?
Well, it's a very good question. Let me make a few observations. March the 11th, 1996, we're in government, we're around the table for the first time. John Howard opens the books and says, there are deficits building at an alarming rate on top of the $96 billion debt we have. We'll have to have a razor gang. I was on that razor gang. One way of cutting this would be to say, firstly, there's the moral issue. That might sound a funny thing to say, but economics is not just about a sweet set of numbers. It's about better outcomes for people. And I remember John Howard saying that day, we need to end the intergenerational theft. That's a moral issue. When a society won't live within its means and expects its unborn, its children and its unborn, to pick up the tab for their ways, that's wrong. Secondly, there's the issue of character. We were able to do it because we stuck to one another like glue, even though, frankly, at times it was unbelievably difficult. We were upsetting our colleagues, we were upsetting the community, media speculation was rife, but no one leaked. Everyone got on with it. We displayed the character and the discipline and the trust to make it work. The third thing I'd say is about leadership. We need our leaders to actually go out there and explain why some things have to be done. And Peter Costello often makes the point that we didn't have a constituency. People say, oh, there's no constituency now for what you're talking about, Peter, cleaning up the Economic Act. We didn't have one either. They weren't actually busting the door down to say, balance the books. You've got to make the case, see it through, and then you get the results. And the results were spectacular. The Australian economy took off. Employment improved out of sight. Living standards started to rise. It was a golden era.
You talk about cabinet solidarity there. You know, that used to be something, and I worked 10 years in the Howard government era. It used to be something you almost took for granted. You know, I had bosses who were cabinet ministers come out of cabinet, go back to their desk, and I'd say, geez, what was the decision? They'd say, well, you can read it on the cabinet, but I'm not going to just talk about what was discussed in the room. They wouldn't give me a sense of who spoke for or against a particular item. And it never turned up in the papers the way it does now. And I think that's something we don't talk about enough, isn't it?
Goes to character. We were able to do it because of character. We'd been out of government for a long time. We believed in good policy. By the way, we had the backing of tremendous backing from a lot of industry groupings in those days. Business wasn't woke. Business actually believed in good outcomes for people and employing people and their wages rather than virtue signalling. And the NFF was unbelievably good in advocating for good policy. But it goes to character. It goes to sticking together with your mates through the thick and the thin because you believe in what you're doing. And you're quite right. During the 10 years that I was in cabinet, I hardly remember even the suggestion of a leak. And that went to the government's credibility and the sense of teamwork.
One of the things I notice every time I look at the budget papers, and I think this is because, like you know, I grew up in a country town in a regional area, is the weight of regional Australia in terms of their contribution, and not just agriculture, export dollars, of course, but a lot of our mining exports, our resource exports come from regional communities. And I'm not so sure that those in urban areas understand that, appreciate that enough. You know, they talk down regional Australia, call them rednecks. They think that their votes can be basically dismissed because the big seats, the big numbers are in our big cities around the country. And there's anger also involved in all of this now with the rollout of renewables and the way in which a lot of regional communities and profitable, really good farmland will now be crisscrossed and basically put out of operation due to transmission towers and wind farms and these massive solar panel installations. How do you think regional Australia feels this budget week?
I think somewhat cynical and forgotten, but probably increasingly alarmed at the direction of things. Very interesting that we've had reports recently, astute observation made the other day, is that we, like most countries in the world, we have a cost of living crisis, but we also have a cost of manufacturing crisis. It's costing so much to do business in this country that our biggest single manufacturing sector, which is food production and fibre production and drinks production, servicing the Australian people and many times more people internationally because we export so much, it's at risk in this country. Can you believe it? And maybe that'll be a wake-up call for people. The regions matter, and we have a government backed by Greens and independents who seem determined to even push the government's not only ignorance of what we do in the regions, but frankly, their desire to shut down every industry that creates wealth. I mean, we're against all the things, it seems, that make us money. And the response needs to be calm, tough reason. Again, a lesson from history. The 80s were not good years for farming, and we had a Labor government that in some ways was certainly better than the current Labor government, a lot better. But agriculture was being ignored. And with the leadership of the NFF and country members of Parliament, a really calm, determined, won't back away approach was adopted to tackling the government of the day. There was an incredible rally in Canberra. The Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, came out to address it. And it started to create some movement that was backed by careful research and policy development, not just whinging.
John, a quick comment on Labor's move to ban live sheep exports. There was a mass walkout today from a speech by the Agricultural Minister, Murray Watt. What's your comment there?
I find this inexplicable. I go back to what I said a moment ago. They seem to be determined to close every industry that you could think of that actually creates wealth and actually, frankly, when it comes to food exports, helps us play our role in feeding people internationally. And I have every confidence that live exports can be managed in a humane way. And farmers do actually care about their animals. Might surprise people, but you don't get good quality prices for poor quality stock, and you don't get good quality stock if you don't look after them.
John Anderson, terrific as always. See you next time.